Hello everyone, and welcome to the third conversation in the Future Art Ecosystems live series. My name is Benedict Singleton. I'm Director of Design at Rival Strategy, who co-produced the Future Art Ecosystem publication series with the Serpentine R&D team. Joining me is the illustrious Professor Rachel Armstrong for a conversation about her practice and what it means for future art ecosystems. Rachel, would you perhaps like to introduce yourself, and then I can say a little more about kind of the context of our conversation?
Yes, I'm Rachel Armstrong and I'm Professor of Experimental Architecture at Newcastle University. And I'm developing an ecological platform that uses the material properties of living systems to perform useful work.
That is a great short definition that I'm sure there'll be lots that comes out of over the next half an hour, 40 minutes. Yes, well, thank you again for joining us today, Rachel. It's nice to see you again. I think the last time we saw each other was when you were a contributor to the first volume of Future Art Ecosystems, which for those who have just tuned in, is a publication series that looks at the infrastructure developing for kind of cultural practices, focused like partly on art, but then also much broader than that as well. So looking at music and so forth. The first issue of Future Art Ecosystems is on art and advanced technologies. And if you go to futureartecosystems.org, you can get a copy of the first strategic briefing, as we call them, which are intended to give organizations and practitioners some kind of insight to the landscape that is emerging around cultural institutions as they change in this particularly volatile, let's say, times. And the first issue came out of our long conversations with the Serpentine and others working with various cultural practices about the way that the art industry, as you might call it, is not set up at all really to deal with the ways in which artists who are working with, say, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, and so on, are in fact working. So I'm sure many of these themes will come out through the course of our conversation, but just, to get things moving, perhaps it would be nice, Rachel, to hear from you about your practice and how you go about what you do, and we can talk a little about like some of the interesting dimensions of that.
Right. Thank you very much, Benedict, for the introduction and for the context as well of the discussion. So the kind of work that I do is multidisciplinary. It's grounded in architecture, but it very much links with synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, the arts, performance, engineering, a whole raft of different practices and knowledge sets. And essentially, why we're working together is because we need another platform for human development effectively, one that moves away from the machine, because machines at best can only have a 0 footprint on the earth. And actually, since we're using up more than one earth, depending on where you are, it can range from 2 whole earths to 5 earths in Australia, for example. So we actually need to have a platform that actually gives back, and gives back in a way that makes sense to the natural systems that generate the resources that we use in the first place. And so while there have been a lot of proposals as to how to do that, they've all been limited by the mechanistic platforms that have informed our thinking for at least the last 500 years. So it sounds a bit like magical thinking, but what might a technological platform be that can actually connect with nature in a meaningful way and regenerate the resources that we're using all the time? But there is a technology that exists. We don't see it as a technology, and that technology is nature. So if we think about spiders' webs, and we think about compost heaps, and we think about bacteriophages that give bacteria a bunch of genetic tools in order to be able to create antibiotic resistance, nature has a whole bag of technologies. But we've only just reached the time in our own conceptual and practical development where we're starting to be able to understand, that these are actually technologies. And then secondly, that we might be able to tap into these. We find it quite hard to leave behind the baggage of, let's call it the hard engineering and physical sciences, in the linear causalities, certainties, and universalities that frame scientific thought and practice. So when we have a new platform, something like nature, and we're able to access it, how do we start to do that? So the first things that I was doing was working on this idea of living materials. Now, living becomes a very interesting word because, like life, there isn't a fixed and fast definition. That's very frustrating for sciences. I've been in meetings in Denmark where we're trying to define what a living technology or a living material is. And so the question comes up, well, is a living technology a horse? Well, yeah. Well, is it a robot that looks after the elderly? Yeah. So we're thinking then about, there seems to be no limits to what a living technology is. So that's frustrating for science. But from arts and design, it's actually very interesting because it's about pattern recognition rather than making categories and starting to recognize forms of expression and ways of working that seem lifelike. So that's good enough for the arts and design. And so living materials is really a spectrum that hasn't been defined of surfaces, substrates, liquids that exhibit some of the properties of living things that are recognizable to us in some way, but may not necessarily be given the full status of life. That also is interesting because once you invoke the living, we're also invoking an ethics. And so, what is right and what is wrong and what is appropriate is really framed in this rather complex set of propositions that are played out through material exchange. So in order to even start to figure out the rules of this, we do need an inherently interdisciplinary team. We need the technical aspects and the scientific aspects that say this is a bunch of materials that might start to work in this way. And we need the arts and design elements that say, okay, we're observing what's going on. Actually, I now start to see some pattern connections that link to other things that resonate with society, resonate with culture, resonate with the individual and the body. So the kinds of things we've done, and so I've worked with embodied artificial life-like forms or dynamic droplets called protocells, which are really simple chemistries, but they have a metabolism. And so if you add concentrated alkali to extra virgin olive oil, you can get a little body that moves around in an environment and starts to mark it with these soft, soapy skins. And as you look at its expressions and as you look at its relationships with other bodies that are broken away from the droplet, you really start to recognize very lifelike exchanges, and some of them are quite surprising. They seem to work in populations. They communicate without fusing with each other. And that's kind of surprising because if you thought of two bubbles floating around, the second they come into proximity, they'll fuse into a bigger bubble. But these dynamic droplets don't do that. So it raises questions about the science as to what's happening, the things that are happening at the oil-water interface and the chemical transformations. But it's actually also asking questions about, okay, so can we direct these in some ways? How much control might we have over them in order to negotiate potentially with them some kind of outcome? So these dynamic droplets were used in various contexts, mostly in the laboratory. They were taken out for a walk, let's say, on the side of the Venetian lagoon in large tanks with Red Bull. And we looked at, how the droplets started to form little soapy calcium skins around objects that we'd fished out from the canal. And so we were looking at the idea of potentially these droplets were going to form a limestone-like coating around the foundations of the city, and as it were, create a living sealant for when the water levels went up and down, so that the wood piles would not be exposed to the air and therefore rot through bacterial action. So that was one set of living technologies and materials that I was using. Others were activated gels, which were really based on early chemistries for photography. And in the development of some of these early chemistries, potassium chromate and silver nitrate, they started to form self-organizing bands. And so that led to the discovery of self-organizing chemistries, things like Liesegang rings. And so we've also been using these in geometric configurations, creating chemical banding hubs to create interference patterns with time. And so we can start to see the distribution of matter in space. These were installed within the Hylozoic ground installation by Philip Beasley in 2010 at the Venice Biennale, and they became part of a much more expanded cybernetic network that was reading the presence of environmental bodies, so people and gases in the case of the droplets and the self-organizing chemistries. They were picking up carbon dioxide, and that was causing transformations. So those were quite simple explorations, both interrogated through the limits of our understanding of science and the way that we can physically manipulate the environments, but also interrogated through kind of artistic and cultural questions. And the one that I've recently just completed is with a group of 6 institutions, a project called Living Architecture, which is really thinking about what happens when these living materials and technologies, and again, there's a fuzziness between what is a living material and what is a living technology, because both perform the work of life. One has a body that one exposes to an audience, but a living technology could equally be a living material. So there are questions about identification and the categorization of these entities performing work in concert with natural systems, and how we start to, express what we're seeing and also relate to the things that we're seeing. So, so living architecture is really thinking about what if we took a living space and instead of having fossil fuel-based systems to heat and process our activities, then could we actually do this through the process of metabolism? Now, the kinds of chemistries I was working with were not sustained long enough, really, to do this over the lifespan of a building. So we looked to microbes as being the metabolic hubs, the little transformers that could live and persist within specifically designed environments. So the collaborators here were University of Newcastle, was working with the experimental architecture group there, and Marine Applied Sciences. Also the University of West of England, working with the Bristol Bioenergy Centre there, led by Yanis Aropoulos. The University of Trento, led by Martin Hanzert, looking at dynamic chemistries. The Spanish National Research Council, absolutely amazing at synthetic biology. Explorer Biotech, which is a biotech software company. So they were making web-based DNA design tools so that we could design and engineer sequences more intuitively. And also Liquid for Systems Group, which is a design-based architectural group in Vienna. So quite an international group, European, obviously. It was funded by the EU to the tune of 3.2 million euro. And the idea was essentially, first of all, to create little houses for microbes. So we know that when we feed microbes things, they have a metabolism and they can transform waste into a set of compounds. So rather than just having monocultures, what we thought we'd do was to set up conversations between microbes in different environments so that the input for one system was transformed by the microbes living in each little bioprocessor or house for microbes. And the waste could then be used by the second group of microbes. But it wasn't and their waste is transformed and so on. So it wasn't necessarily a linear system. We thought of it as actually being a programmable system where different inputs from various metabolic communities would have different relationships with each other. So the idea was then to make waste processing apps for a home, so that we could take liquid waste like urine and grey water and transform that into things like cleaned water, different forms of biomass. So that could be things like phosphate or cellulose, and also remove pollution, so nitrous oxides, and finally create clean water. So instead of just processing one thing, when we think about utilities, we think about, how are the water services going to move through a building? Or we think about, where does the heat come from? Where does the electricity come from? We think of them as being single systems. Well, these metabolic processors, like a compost heap in some ways, are processing many different things all at once. And so the engineering and design tasks were, how did we actually create the different living spaces and environments that did particular kinds of work that were meaningful to the microbes, but also meaningful to human inhabitants? So that was actually quite a journey over the course of the 3 years. And actually we did both laboratory-based work on site, but one of the other things that we did was actually move around between different laboratories and got a sense of different working spaces, and also had group on-site meetings where we talked through the design and the progress and had project review meetings at these stages. So in some ways there was no really, at the beginning, there was no central laboratory that was doing all the development. When we decided that there was an installation to be made, we decided which laboratory it was going to be built in, which was Bristol. And then we actually had to work through postal services and remote services in order to transfer things like genetically modified organisms from Spain to Bristol. So there were logistical dimensions to that. We made a lot of use of online meetings as well. And actually, I think the key thing to it really was a robust management system that actually led to empowerment at the level of each research group, but also a coordination through the management and a management team in the centre, who were also coordinating with arts venues and cultural events, so that we could take elements of the development and start to interrogate them in public as the project was developing. So we didn't do the usual scientific thing, which was 3 years in secrecy and a great big reveal. There was a lot of openness in terms of how the project developed. There was obviously IP that was protected for things like 2 gene patents. But most of the other stuff, and there was also a commercial product that was launched called Dulix, which is this web-based DNA-based design tool that was launched by Explorer Biotech. So there was quite a diverse range of products, but it also led to a whole bunch of exhibition displays. So things like living bricks were exhibited at Tallinn at the 4th Biennale there. Also, places like the Building Centre. And then actually, as the project progressed, the builds got more complex. And so we started working actually with more performance-based work to try and introduce the body into the space. And I would say that our the build, I think, that was most meaningful in terms of the public interface was actually the work that we did at the Whitechapel Gallery with Cecile B. Evans, which was called 999 Years, 13 Square Meters, The Future Belongs to Ghosts. Not a scientific title, obviously. And that was really in the theme of the Whitechapel Galleries, is this tomorrow? A much more unstable question than the 1956 This is Tomorrow that was asserted as the forerunner of this exhibition. But what it did do was to look at the future of an apartment without humans. So in some ways you could think of it as being the first post-human apartment, because it had a living wall, bricks that housed microbes that were quite happy to take food and, you know, be pooped once a week. And they generated, you know, kind of electrical outputs that could be read on display screens. And so the space had an inner life that wasn't human. And so the idea of the kind of the post-human occupancy was quite intriguing. Again, thinking about, you know, who are we living alongside with, you know, when we're thinking about our futures, obviously about microbiomes, which is really topical now. And also about what kinds of energy do we need? Because the microbes themselves produce quite low levels of energy. So, you know, in the terms of, you know, tens of watts in a very big stack. So each brick would produce about, you know, 0.2 milliwatts, you know. So, but, you know, as you stack them up, the power gets bigger. So we could realistically power maybe a 12-volt battery supply, which is interesting because actually there are 12-volt homes now being built. So do we really need 320 volts for each home? Can we actually think about apartments that are fed entirely on waste, working on 12-volt supplies? So it's raising a lot of questions about the future of the way we live. You know, what's inside our dark spaces and, you know, where we normally put the boiler. What if those spaces were living and we were feeding them with our own waste? And in that, in some ways, you know, if we're feeding them with our own waste, our own microbes are getting incorporated into those environments. And so this holobiontic state of affairs, where, you know, if we did, you know, screens of genes, then, you know, what would be the difference between the microbes in the bricks and the microbes on our bodies, you know, particularly as they're part of our waste streams. So raising a lot of questions, and the project itself was a successful proof of principle. So we demonstrated that. There's still a long way to go in terms of, you know, what innovation streams ask you to do, which is productize. And I think for me, actually, the point at which I start to raise questions myself really are the economic systems in which we are operating. Because you know, let's call it the framework for the European Union is really, you know, the neoliberal one where, you know, public money becomes taken up by research groups, invested into private companies get big and become multi-corporates. But at this level where we're actually thinking about homes and we're thinking about potentially shared resources, because many people live in a home, and what happens if we scaled that to a community dimension, we really start to invite the question of commons. And so if there is a tradable resource within a commons, what kinds of economic frameworks and economic instruments might we introduce into the innovation? Not just to say, yay, great, we're off on the innovation stream and we can get a commercializable product that feeds into, you know, capitalist systems. But actually, are there other opportunities here, given that, you know, this is coming from a place where we really want to start to change the paradigms of value. We want to change the way that we do things. We want to change the way that we want to relate to nature. So having the arts and design in this space, for me is a really good thing. It's raised these questions. You know, my artsy and design colleagues, you know, have been you know, fantastic in terms of developing some of these conversations. But it also creates challenges going forwards in the sense that actually, you know, to get further funding, we've got to head down a certain kind of way of thinking.
Right.
And there's a more interesting one.
Yes. I was going to ask exactly that, actually. That so I mean, on this a large scale initiative, that I mean, it's clearly, you know, it's like a tech innovation project.
Yeah,
in a sense. It would be recognizable as such too, for example, like an EU funding council, because they see the opportunities for productization. It's clearly technological, yet it's not what the tech industry does at all.
Right.
But that likewise, it seems unusual, perhaps increasingly less unusual, or that's part of the, I guess, the wager of future art ecosystems, that that such programs would begin to surface in like a gallery space or some other kind of, you know, culturally enshrined space. And so I was wondering what is your experience with the negotiation of these two things been? I mean, I don't want to slip into sort of blasé kind of things about our two cultures, science and art and that kind of thing, but clearly there's a sort of like economic and productized funding model on the one hand. There's another arguably economic productized funding model on the art side, and like how you're sitting in between them. So how does that work in practice?
Well, I think they definitely go in tandem. And I think the biggest insight for me was at the Whitechapel Gallery, when I was, you know, with Cecile, was, you know, kind of working her space, and I was hanging by the microbial fuel cell wall. And I noticed people were looking at it, and you could see that they didn't, because we weren't allowed any explanations on the wall. You know, stage one of the science and tech fail.
Right.
We often have to explain the technologies to say what they do, but actually in an arts environment, you know, they're standing alone. And so I'd see people come up and they'd look at it, not really make any sense of it, and start to walk on. So I thought, right, I'm going to go in and have a conversation. And so I started talking to some of the visitors, and they were all very, you know, well informed in terms of, you know, kind of arts practice. And when they started to understand that there were, you know, living things inside these bricks that had this life, and that they were doing things differently than fossil fuels, I actually saw, you know, complete changes in the way that people responded to the work. There was one old guy who just went, you know what, I wish I could live to see this being implemented. I've grown up, you know, understanding that humanity's damaging the planet. This is really something that gives me hope. And I was thinking, well, you don't really get that out of, let's call it the technical explanations, being in the presence of someone, experiencing someone, and let's call it the communities of ideas, because the gallery visitor is bringing a set of ideas with them. They have, you know, their own concerns about their future, their past, the things that connect with them. And then you're bringing a set of ideas. So the artist and the, you know, tech team are bringing their ideas, and it takes on an embodied form. And I think it creates an incredible encounter. And I say that the word that I did, that wrote, you know, came to mind was wonder. I actually saw wonder on people's faces. Again, there was a young man in his, he was saying that, you know, he would love his little boy to be able to see this, so that, you know, maybe that's something that he would work to in the future, because he didn't have a narrative to tell his son about why we should keep on going. And so that was really quite interesting. And so the context of the art gallery and the art space for me is really about drawing together the communities of ideas, the things that lurk around in the background of our conversations, our wishes, our hopes, our fears, and that they connect and mingle. And I think that, you know, those kinds of understandings and those moments of insight, or maybe even moments of repulsion, oh my God, you know, it's got microbes in it, aren't they dangerous? Those kinds of things are points, tipping points really, that can be challenged or guided or negotiated, or maybe not. But that for me is the really exciting point, where you can move forwards with, you know, one set of actions, or you can, you know, go in another direction. So I actually thought that the Whitechapel Gallery's gallery space as a site of encounters and a community of ideas was really exciting for me.
Mm. And that must be, it's interesting that the way that you're going to frame some of these interactions is like being founded on the necessity of some kind of exposition of what people are looking at, which is not a particularly dominant thing in contemporary art, right? You know, if people involve exposition as like part of work, then it takes on a certain kind of self-consciousness and so on. But I was thinking while you were talking that surely it's at least the same amount of exposition must happen with kind of like, you know, tech companies or for that matter, people like the EU, you know, like funding bodies themselves, where this project has to be narrated in a way that it simply is not like, you know, the kinds of projects that they've historically seen. And yeah, so what's your sense of that?
That's very interesting because, you know, we would have really liked to have had the evaluators on site for the final review. And that wasn't possible, partly because of genetic modification, but also because many of these tech projects, as you've indicated, are actually evaluated through data and the proof of efficacy and efficiency. And so there's a certain set of values that carry a scientific project forward. And yet there's a I mean, you know, it's always better when something works, I mean, even in the arts. But there are a different set of values that carry the project and the interest in the project forward from that. So I think that there are different evaluation tool sets that are introduced into these environments, and the dominant ones are economic and they're scientific. And you know, so that the social, cultural community of ideas arguments are interesting, but they're not the ones that are going to persuade an investor, or they're not going to be the ones that seek further funding. Although I will say that the EU has also had the FET Pro Act projects, which are about building uptake communities. And I think for me, this is actually where, you know, design and art really starts to come into its own, because in order to build an uptake community, you really need to tap into those communities of ideas and the contexts in which you know, the communities are encountering your work. So there are different stages in the EU's thinking, but it's still, you know, it is still not thought that design and art are central to the innovation process, because it's a very particular kind of thing.
And I can imagine, I mean, with many of these technologies, because they are at such early stages, and they're kind of fragile, both as, you know, materials and also as ideas, if you see what I mean, that the sort of, say, Silicon Valley inspired model of funding looks for kind of like dramatic results, rapid growth, kind of painless, or at least only causing pain to other people in terms of its application. Whereas with these technologies, they're kind of like quite provisional, right, at this point. And I was wondering how you think about your practice in the sense of like creating an arena for these, you know, kind of like high risk, in some sense, and also, but also kind of like fragile and provisional so experiments, which even within the scientific community, like often, you know, failed, you know, data of a failure is irrelevant, right? So it's just, it gets wiped from the hard drive. Yes, so like how, I was wondering what your perspective was on that, and kind of like how does your practice suggest a way of incubating these technologies for potentially longer periods and with less sort of dramatic?
So I like this question because I think there's a different process at work here. I think when you're building a platform and you're trying to, let's say, test a vision, and I think one of the things that I do is, you know, so you can think about all kinds of things about in the future. But how do you actually know whether your ideas are verifiable or if they're, valuable to particular people? So you kind of have to set up, this is the whole thing about experimental architecture for me. You have to set up the experiments and the context in which, you actually allow yourself to validate or disprove your ideas so that you can actually build on multiple fronts. So you don't put all your eggs in one basket and go, it's the living architecture project or die. You develop, so some of the work is done with no budget whatsoever, but a bunch of people who are really interesting and they've got great ideas, and that in some ways through arts and design, you can simulate, what might happen if these things came together and produce a work out of that. So by, let's say, prototyping ideas at the same time as doing material experiments, some of them are models, and some of them you're lucky enough to get the funding to do things for reality. But what you're not doing is following a linear development path. You're scattering lots of different ideas, which maybe at first glance seem quite unrelated. So why would we work with circus performers in a darkened room with lots of multiple surfaces and bowls of fish and protozoals? And then you've got very high tech ones, which is about developing a biodigital interface. But actually, as you start to read the different performances and installations and models, and even actually in classrooms, through student work and kind of rendering things to functionality, you start to see how the ideas start to connect and how they start to form each other, and that a particularly able circus body and their relationship to water and surface and interface and touch actually informs the way that you might touch a screen for a biodigital surface for a microbe. Mm-hmm. So I think that the way I think is different than the science and technology development is the forms of funding are distributed, the laboratories and skill sets are distributed. It is actually, I think, the word that you'd use as well, it's almost like a commons of innovation, but it's built on a community of trust. That's really important because some of these ideas will go on and get IP, and that there is still, the competition for funding and, other kind of background things that are going on. So building the community of people that you work with, as well as sharing those ideas appropriately and kind of working with people again and again in different contexts, actually starts to build, what I was describing at the Whitechapel Gallery, that kind of background, the threshold that's changing the threshold for a tipping point to move into another phase of development. And so I think this is really, if we were looking at the artistic and design-based innovation in this, it's really raising the threshold for the possibility of these risky ideas that the EU are asking for in an FET open project. You won't get a funded project unless it's got risk in it. But I think what the arts and design is doing is actually just raising that threshold for its success and for its uptake. And so I think that there is a very significant contribution that is done. And I think that the creative communities have different ways of thinking into relating to the ideas and how they express them. And I think reading those and kind of understanding their relevance to, let's say, more linear scientific or technical work is actually also a skill that's required in these very complex projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And this raises a question for me as well, as I know you, amongst many other hats that you wear, one is that of an educator. How would you advise kind of a young practitioner to become involved in this kind of work? Because I think this is one of the reactions we've had to future art ecosystem, like a rightfully critical thing, is that kind of like, it's one thing talking about extremely large scale practices with, sort of like relatively established kind of working processes and so on. But it's another thing thinking about, someone who's, I don't know, 18 years old and is maybe thinking of doing a BFA or something. So how would you articulate, I guess, the opportunities to bootstrap yourself into these kinds of practices in your experience?
Yeah, so I think for the students that you know, come into the experimental architecture studio, I think the first thing is that we really want to know who they are as a designer. That it's really important for them to actually confront who they are and what their value systems are. And the way that we try and do that is by let's say developing their capacity for experiment. So we don't want them to think in terms of solutions and buildings. We want to think in terms of relations, visions, the kinds of things that appeal to them, and start to choreograph and work those to a point where that they are testable, either through drawing, and you know, I subscribe to the Lebbeus-Woods school of experiment. You know, a drawing is a kind of laboratory practice in itself. And you know, so, and you know, can they actually do simple things at home? And I think that's one of the interesting things, that this idea of democratizing what constitutes a laboratory and what constitutes an experiment, and the modes of validation and the learning that comes out of these explorations, I think is the role of the educator, really. That you know, that some of our students have had fantastic opportunities to go into scientific labs and work with top-class scientists, and they're doing amazing work. Others haven't had that opportunity for all kinds of different reasons, but what we can do is rehearse the choreography of exchange and the kinds of questions and observations that they might make in response to unknowns. And if anything, it's really about preparing the student of design for the unknown. How do you go about addressing something that you don't even really know how to articulate it yet? And so, you know, kind of looking and rendering and kind of exploring and interrogating and juxtaposition, taking something out of context and sticking it in another context and re-narrating it. It's actually a fantastic way of understanding something that you're not really sure of. So what we try and do is give them a whole bunch of tools through which they can conduct what we might call design-led experiment. And I think once you let that genie out of the bottle, it is something that they will draw on again. At the beginning, nobody really understands it, but I think if you hold fast and go through the pain barrier of confusion, at the end of it, you look back at it and you go, oh, hang on, now I make sense of what I've been through. And actually, most of them want to do it again.
And speaking of doing it again, I'm afraid we're almost out of time, but I would like to ask you, so what are you working on now? What can we look forward to?
Well, the project that we're working on now is the Active Living Interface Controlled Environment project, which is ALICE. And that is setting up a biodigital interface to start to make meaningful exchanges with microbes. And so that's a team with the University of West of England and Translating Nature, led by Julie Freeman and the Experimental Architecture Group. And effectively, it's an augmented reality experience where a microbial fuel cell stack is collecting data from the microbes inside, producing electricity. That's being relayed to a server, translated into interactive animations. And those are encountered in augmented reality, allowing the user to make certain decisions, which then changes the feedstock going back into the microbial fuel cell stack and creating a microbial feedback loop. So very, very, very simple. But the idea of having more than human conversations, rather than imposing human design upon something, to actually open up a tool set for more than human relations. So if we're designing an architecture, who is our community? Is it just the humans, or do we actually have to take other bodies and other agencies into account, and particularly in an ecological age, including your microbiome? And if so, how do we start to do that? What are the tools? What are the approaches we need? So Alice is one of those tools and explorations that will provide us a lot more information about what works well, what connects. And Julie's brilliant at relating these very insightful projects through the digital domain and data. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing what the final experience is. We're hoping that will be in the Matadero sometime in November, and it'll be online, so everyone can go.
Excellent. I look forward to seeing it as well. Thank you very much, Rachel. It's always a pleasure. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with?
I think you had asked earlier on, which was about what can the arts organisations maybe do in order to facilitate these things. And I just had a few thoughts. One was about arts communicators. In the 1990s, we had this big surge where science communication was needed because there'd been some, great misunderstandings, let's call it, between the public and the experts. And I'm wondering if the role of an arts communicator, different than an arts critic, different than an artist, is something that might actually, be an interesting, position to think about. Another one is about creating more of those spaces for dreaming into, for the exchange of the community of ideas. There really aren't that many places to go to talk about climate change and what our appropriate responses might be. We can protest. So Greta Thunberg has, shown us that protest gets attention, but what do we do next after that? And I think that for me is really an important space for, to support with the arts. And then I think the other one is really about the arts organisations allying themselves with science and technology events, and maybe awarding prizes or fellowships, or even just an acknowledgement of kind of artistic and design contributions, because it will focus people's attention and it will associate, advanced technologies with the arts and design. So they can really use their weight in that context. I mean, I think that things like the Starts Prize in the EU is a good one, but I think more of that will really help let's say non-arts communities actually recognise and value the contributions of arts in these contexts.
Fantastic final note. Thank you again so much, and speak to you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.